All right, now let's talk about watercolor. This is probably the medium you most identify with water-based media. Many people have the perception that watercolor can be really easy, but actually a good watercolor can have its challenges. And the reason it's challenging is because watercolor is transparent. So when we work in opaque mediums, we can cover up things, we can make corrections. However, when you want to work with watercolor, mistakes become really obvious. So what you put down is what you get, but we're going to learn to work with it so it isn't frustrating, all right? So some of the things we're going to talk about today are selecting the best brush for the job. We are going to work on a custom surface by stretching paper on a drawing board using tape. We'll also work with a watercolor block. We'll explore a variety of brush strokes to understand the different behaviors of the medium, wet into wet, wet into dry. We'll play with those a little bit. So in general, watercolor differs from all of our other mediums because the pigment in watercolor is milled to be suspended finer and used transparently. Also, the watercolor doesn't seal, so if you want to squish back and forth, you're going to bring up previous layers. So the kind of brush stroke is very important. The layers will show through, again, because it's transparent. The watercolor, you can, again, as I was saying, you could do it on a stretched paper, you could do it on a water block. We'll talk about when to use each. And again, remember that watercolor differs from other mediums because of its transparency. We have to preserve the lights. In other mediums, we might work from saturated to light or dark to light, but in the watercolor, we can't put lights in on top. We have to preserve the lights. So my advice to you with watercolors, as with many of the other mediums, buy the best watercolors you can. I know that it's really tempting to use something that's really pretty and colorful. You might find this in your local Five and Dime or drugstore. I would ask you not to buy your art supplies in the drugstore. And the reason is that they're inexpensive because they lack pigment. So we are not going to use the watercolors in the pan. There are some better quality ones. My preference is to use tubes of good quality watercolor paint. But the good news is you don't need that many tubes. We've got a warm and a cool of each primary once again. So 6 or 7 tubes and you're good. Okay, now let's start talking about your supports. So if you are working bigger than your watercolor block, let's say you want to work on a board, it's going to be really important to keep that paper from rippling. And the way that we do that is we're going to tape it down. However, first, I'm going to teach you a really easy, effective way of cutting or making your paper smaller without using a razor or scissors. It's really hard to make a perfectly straight line sometimes with a scissor. So this is a foolproof way that will also give you a deckled edge. So what I'm going to do is carefully fold my paper in half, and it's all about scoring and breaking down the fibers of your paper. So I've pressed down one way, I'm going to turn it, and now I'm actually going to grab a tool. It's just my painting spatula, and I'm really going to be aggressive in breaking down the edge, breaking down the fibers in the paper. Turn it over one more time. Do it again. This is a 140-pound weight, which is a really, really good weight of paper. If you go any heavier, it's going to be hard to score and rip. It will basically crack on you. So a 140-pound weight is really your sweet spot. That's where I am. Okay, let's give it one more aggressive nudge. And we're going to rip. Now when you rip, you want to keep the back end up and the bottom here, and like a nice quick tug, and we have almost a perfect rip. So the quicker you do that rip, the straighter it will be. The more aggressive you are with scoring, the better it will be. We've got a couple of little dings here. It's not going to matter because when I use my tape, we'll create a border. So those little dings will be on the border. So the next thing I want to do before I start messing with my water is cut my gummed paper. So this is brown craft paper that has a gum adhesive on one side. And the reason I want to start messing with it before I start with the water is because it will stick to everything. So let's do this while the surface is still dry, and it doesn't have to be exact. It just has to be big enough to cover each side. You can buy the brown paper in craft store or any place that sells watercolor supplies. Again, I'm not being exact, just making sure it's big enough to cover, and it's okay to have overlaps as you go. The other thing I've got here on the table are sponges, watercolor sponges. One of them I will dedicate to the gummy tape, and the other one I will use to smooth the paper, and I really don't want to mix the two. So I'm going to move these out of the way, and there's a couple of different ways you can wet your paper. If you have a receptacle large enough, you can soak this paper. You want to use hot water, but not too hot. What can happen is paper is sized with a chemical. If you soak it for too long in too hot water, you break down the sizing. Instead of soaking it, we're going to take a mister. Again, here's my favorite mister. And we're just going to spray both sides of the paper. And we're going to wet it down this way. I'm going to turn it. Also, there will be a right side and a wrong side to your watercolor paper. The right side has a little bit more texture. Again, that's your cold press. So you can see that the minute I wet one side, it wants to curl the other way. But if I wet both sides, it isn't. So in wetting it, I'm breaking the fibers down just enough so that when it dries, it'll kind of curl back up and be tight as a drum. And when you paint on it, it will not ripple. Okay, now to wet my strips, little different process. A little bit of water on your sponge, not too much. And I'm just going to take that down the strip of paper. So you don't want it soaking wet, you just want it kind of tacky. And I'm just going to lay that down. It's kind of a fun process. And if I felt like my paper was buckling a little bit, you can take your other sponge, your clean sponge, and kind of pass it over the paper. And now all we have to do is let it dry and it will tighten right up. Your other option for your support is a watercolor block. And these are a little bit easier to use in that obviously you don't have to stretch the paper, they're portable, but they tend to be limited in size. Again, if I thought I wanted to work bigger, I have the option of making a custom sized page or stretching. All right, now here's the trick to these. First of all, you want to remove the black piece, and what you want to look for is a notch. So if you can see, I have a little interruption in the gummed edge. That is where I want to take a sharp, but not too sharp object. This is a palette knife. You could use a butter knife. Don't use a razor blade. You might end up actually cutting your pages. And I'm just going to gently run that along the edge. Again, you must start at your notch. If you don't know the notch secret, you're gonna have trouble doing this, but once you know, it's pretty easy. And we're just passing that all the way through, and we're going to reveal, and actually, now I can just rip. There is my first beautifully stretched, ready to go first piece of paper. This is 140 pounds, and it's cold press. So what I like to say about remembering cold press versus hot press is that cold press has bumps, and when you're cold, you get goosebumps. So this paper has goosebumps, and you want the bumps because it holds the water, it holds the paint. You can get paper that's even more cold pressed but I think then you end up with hills and valleys and you might have trouble getting the paint down into the hills. So I think this is a nice surface to work on. So we are ready to paint. I don't have to do anything else to this paper. It is perfectly flat. It's not going to ripple. It's not going anywhere. I am ready to go. Okay, let's talk about techniques for watercolor. And we're going to be dealing with all the different variables, but there's one really important trick that you have to know right away, and you're probably already thinking about it, and that is that how do I preserve my whites? Well, sometimes it's easy. You can just paint around things if you want like a softer edge. But sometimes there are many small areas, there are reflections or highlights that you need to preserve, and it's just too hard to paint around them. So we use something that's called Frisket. Fun word. And the Frisket, it's sort of like your rubber cement that you used to use when you were little. We would paint it on using a very small brush, and then as it dries, we can paint right over it. We don't have to worry about it again. When the painting is finished, you can either use your finger or some special erasers just to pick that right up. There's also something called a Frisket pen, which will give you even finer lines if you want to. And it is really a lifesaver for preserving your whites. We're going to use this when we get to our landscape demo. So think about the Frisket. All right, let's start looking at some of the variables. And the variables are very much about wet paper, dry paper, and the kinds of brushes that you use. What's really important is going to be thinking about a gradient. In watercolor, because we don't add in white, we can use the gradient to let the white of the paper show through. So let's say we had a sky that we wanted to move from dark to light. That's a good place to use a gradient. So watercolor is all about water, the amount of water on your brush, how much water your brush holds, and also, do you put water on your ground or not? So let's start with a dry gradient. And I'm going to pick a nice, cool blue. This is your ultramarine blue. The palette is, again, a warm and cool of each, but look how little paint I have to use, and I get this explosion of color. We don't have to load the brush up with pigment the way we did with the gouache. Here it's really all about the water. Okay, so I'm just going to make one stroke from top to bottom, and you're going to see this gradient. Nice, huh? Okay, so that was wet into dry. Now I'm going to wet the paper first, and you're going to see the somewhat softened effect of the gradient on the wet paper. So I'm going to just wet that paper first. If it was a bigger area, I could actually take my bottle and spray this down. And here is the difference. You'll also notice I'm working flat. If I raise this drip here is really going to be a drip, and it will flow with the gravity. So you want to work flat for this. And here is my wet into wet gradient. And it's just a much softer, more delicate, mistier kind of a feel. We have a lot of options. These are separate strokes. Let's talk about edges. We can do a wet paper with wet into wet that's going to mix and get real sploochy. Sploochy is not a word, but I think it works very well here. So let's wet the paper, and we're going to work wet into wet with wet edges. So this is when you want that gradual mixing. You don't need a hard edge. We'll stick with the blue. Again, very little pigment. Goes a long way. Now you can leave the watercolors in your palette. You don't even have to mist them. You can just close them up and then re-wet them the next day and you're good to go. So here is a nice sploochy color, very sploochy. And let's move now to a red and see what happens to that edge as we start mixing. And we get surprises too, because what you're going to notice is that the pigment follows the water. So if I had like sort of blobs of water and they start bleeding into each other. Another way I can work this is a wet edge bleed. I'm going to do two dry ones, but almost purposefully mix the two. So I get that very gradual merging. Look what's happening here. It's still happening. So as the water flows, the pigment flows with it. And you could take advantage of that in your painting. So I've got red on my brush. Let's continue with the red. Okay, so the paper's dry. Look how different that acts. Kind of stays where I put it. But I can do an overlap and get that wet edge going. And we're getting that little bit of overlap happening. And it merged very nicely, but it's very different than the wet into wet. The next thing I'm going to show you is, let's say you want to be precise. You want a hard edge. How do I do that? You've got to work wet, wet, hard edge, don't mix. So you want to have a little control over your brush. I'm going to stick with the blue. Let's get a little more pigment on there. And we're going to do that hard edge. Okay, here we go. So I was saying it's all about loading up your brush. You need to load up your brush. I didn't have enough paint there. So I'm going to get a little more paint here, a little more water. Better. And now we're going to go for hard edge. So I have to be a little more careful about my stroke. And we're just going to butt right up to that, but not mingle, hopefully. And there we go. And we got a little mingling happening. Let's talk about a few other ways we can use the watercolor. I have some swatches here. And when you buy your watercolor paints, you need to pay attention to not just the color, but other properties that can get a little complicated. We're not going to deal with them too much, but there are two major things that you need to watch for. I'm showing you a paint here that has a staining quality. And so what that means is, in general, when you work with watercolor, you can lift. And lifting means I've put too much pigment down. I can take either a sponge or a paper towel, and I can actually remove that color. But this color, which is labeled on the tube, staining, will not lift. And it is a little more saturated, and we can get beautiful effects with it. You have to decide if you want that or not. The other option would be a granulating color. I've got a color here that is a shadow violet. And you're going to want to read the tube or do some research about which colors are granulating or not. If this is not the effect you want, you will be disappointed. But it gives you a little bit of a texture, a little bit of a bumpiness, and it's a nice effect if that's what you want. So we have staining, which doesn't lift. We have granulating, which gives a texture. These swatches show the layering and the transparency with something we've already talked about, and that is neutralizing complements. So a swatch of violet with a large stroke of yellow in this area of transparency, you can see it's dulled the violet. Same thing with red and green. If you look at this area here, we've got a dulled red, and orange and primary blue, complementary neutralization, same thing. But the effects of the transparencies can be absolutely beautiful. You have to learn to control them. And one thing that will help you do that is always having a swatch sheet by you, so you can say, oh yeah, that's what that color looks like. Here's what the color looks like on top of that. Watercolors can create beautiful effects. You'll get a better result if you do some experimentation before you hit the main event. Our main event is going to be coming up quite soon as we work on a full landscape in watercolor. You can see a finished one behind me. We'll also learn how to use the Frisket to preserve the whites of the